Okay, welcome everybody to the University of Twente and to the Studium Generale. We're very pleased to see you here, and we are honored and delighted to have Carolina Gruyter to talk to us today about Europe at war and how it has changed and how the war has changed us. That is something that we're looking forward to. And I don't want to spend any time saying anything more. Let the evening begin. I give the floor.
Introduction, and good evening to all of you. Super nice to be back in Twente again. Yeah, I don't like these microphones stuck to my clothes, so I hope you can all hear me well. Tonight, we are going to discuss Europe and how it is being changed and transformed in many ways by the war in Ukraine. And also by some other things, but I think a huge mover of many transformations is this war. And I think we look at the world in a different way. It's not the way we look at the world like 10 years ago or 15 years ago. But we also look at ourselves in a different way. But just to explain why this is happening, I'm going to take you back to a French aristocrat, the Marquis de Custine, who lived in early 19th century France. And at that time, a lot of French people, they wanted to have more rights. They wanted to be free, they wanted to have voting rights, they wanted to change the social structure. And of course, the Marquis, like many other people in his social class, he was dead against it. Because he feared that, they would lose their possessions and their power. So what did the Marquis do? He went to Russia. He went to Russia to show, because Russia was even more old-fashioned than France was in a way, under the Tsar. And he went all the way to Russia in a carriage, a horse-drawn carriage, because he wanted to get information about how well Russia was functioning and then come back to France and tell his fellow countrymen, like, the old ways are actually super good. Look at Russia, how well it's functioning. So he went off and he came back 6 weeks later to Paris, completely disgusted with what he had seen in Russia. He had spoken to the Tsar because he was an interesting nobleman for the Tsar, so he had tea several times with the Tsar. He spoke to a lot of people, he traveled a bit, and he was disgusted by what he had seen. The slavery, the autocracy, whereby the Tsar just with the flick of his fingers could decide over the fate of millions of people. And above all, he was angry at his own class, the aristocrats in Russia, who were treating people lower than themselves on the social ladder very badly, but were licking the heels of the imperial coterie to leave everything as it was. So he came back to France and embraced reform. He wrote a book about this, which is called, it's still being printed, which is interesting. It's called La Russie en 1839, so Russia in 1839. And in a way, Custine, by traveling all the way to Moscow, to Russia, found out that actually how European he was. He thought these people were like us. But instead, he discovered that the things that were happening there were even, far worse than what was happening in Europe. So he wrote, and I quote, "Everyone studying that country is happy to live elsewhere." Meaning also that you sometimes, if you want to know who you are, you also have to know who you are not. So when when people were complaining in his neighborhood about politics in France or whatever going wrong, going off the rails in France, he would advise them, go to Russia. It's far worse there. Yeah, okay, now you know what I'm getting at. Huh? Because I think something along these lines is happening today in Europe. And it has to do with politics, but it also has to do with our identity and our self-perception. There was a Franco-German writer called Alfred Grosser. He wrote a book called Wie anders sind die Deutschen. And he wrote, actually, that Hitler and Stalin should have or could have gotten the Charlemagne Prize for good Europeans. Because without our fear of communist totalitarianism, or just the other way around, totalitarian communism, there would not have been a European community. There would not have been any post-war European integration. And in a way, I think Vladimir Putin is in a similar role. He, to a certain extent, is bringing Europeans more together. They're still divided, they will always be. But in the face of what this man is doing, it is a little bit easier for all these divided peoples to feel closer to each other and to decide to act together. We're all, at the moment, finding shelter under a common European roof. Again, we keep bickering and we keep fighting over issues because nobody ever agrees. That's what the EU was invented for, to have a mechanism to solve our disputes in a peaceful way, to shoot with words and not with weapons. And we've been doing that for 73 years, just a few days ago. It was 73 years. So we find more shelter together than before, because it is so damn cold outside of Europe. We are erasing borders. We have the border control agency, Frontex, that we never really wanted in the first place. Huh? They are growing now to 10,000 people to guard our external borders. We are working on an energy union, which nobody ever wanted. I mean, a few member states wanted it and the rest did not. But now we're working on it. We are working on European defense. Even the Netherlands is supporting this, which was always dead against European defense. I mean, big things are happening. We are sending weapons to Ukraine. We're buying weapons for Ukraine. We're buying gas. The Commission is buying gas for all of us. Those kind of things would not have happened a few years ago. The Swedish former Prime Minister Carl Bildt once said, Europe used to be surrounded by a ring of friends. They were friendly, and many of them even wanted to become like us. And now that ring of friends is being replaced by a ring of fire. We have neighbors, many neighbors, who want either to divide us, take our goodies away, or even totally undermine us. I think Europe has undergone several phases. When I grew up, not here in Twente, but on the Veluwe, which is a bit center-east of the Netherlands, during the Cold War, the end of the Cold War. It was, it was a very small Europe. We had fixed borders, especially to the east. And everything, it was also a bit boring. We were all looking at America because everything that was interesting, everything that was new, all came from America. In music, in film, in all kinds of fashion trends and so on. Then, in 1989, the borders came down. And we started fanning out all over the continent. Everybody was traveling, everybody was roaming around, curious. We wanted to get to know our neighbors, and we wanted to be friends with them. And yes, why not? Why don't they all become members, or many of them? So exploring diversity and freedoms. I think already in the 1990s, but especially in the 2000s, there were people already started to ask, like, where does this end? Where does Europe end? And what about, will Turkey ever be a member of the European Union? And how are we going to accommodate this? Will this change Europe, and in what way? And one thing that struck me at the time is that politicians never replied because they didn't know it themselves. They didn't know the answers, so they just ducked them. Which, of course, made the questions even louder. And a lot of populist parties ran away with that question. Now what we see is the reaction to that. People don't want to, they've done, they've roamed around enough. They don't want to explore much more. They just want security. They are looking at Europe, and I'm saying Europe because I've lived in Switzerland and Norway as well, which are part of Europe but not part of the EU. But I can tell you 80 to 90% of everything that is decided in Brussels ends up in Norwegian and Swedish, Swiss legislation as well. And often, when it's good for them, like joint vaccines and so on, European defense, they join in as well. So that's why I'm saying Europe, it's more the community, I would say. So we look at Europe for protection, as a nest where we can be safe. One of the, you probably all know the Eurobarometer poll that they started, in the 1950s, at the end of the 1950s, early 1960s. Every 6 months, they ask people in EU member states the same question. And this is great because then you can compare the answers from back then to the answers that we get now. The question is, are you satisfied that the country that you live in is a member of the EU? 72%, according to the latest poll a few months ago, said yes, we are satisfied. This was the highest score in decades. In 2005, for instance, 50% said it was a good idea. The people who don't think it's a good idea, there are fewer and fewer of them, but especially the group in between who had no clue, who said don't know, that group is largely diminished. So there are huge changes in Europe, even in the psychology, The European Union used to be, somebody's whistling. The European Union used to be good at depoliticizing issues. We had too much politics and too many wars as a result, that what the EU started, or the European community at first, started doing was breaking political problems between member states on whatever the issue was, but there are many issues that they have disagreements about. So breaking these political problems into little technical bits before they get out of control. So depoliticizing was the business of the EU for a long time. And this is also what the market did so well. Now, we are reminded by Putin's war in Ukraine and the atrocities committed there. We are reminded of the very raison d'être of the European Union, which is never again. No more war. Plus jamais ça. But that means it is political. And since our neighbors are sometimes in the ring of fire and are trying to attack us or trying to undermine us, our answer has to be political as well. So it's a very strange moment, I think, for the EU. We cannot keep depoliticizing everything. And at the same time, this is our trade and we have to continue with it. But we are now discussing our policies toward Russia, towards the United States, towards Africa or China. All these issues are political. Everything we do nowadays is political as well. Even we are taking all kinds of decisions to protect the single market, to protect the policies that we have, which is a political decision in a way. Not to let anybody from outside the EU invest in European companies. Because we've done this for decades without checking it. Europe was open. But now, at some point, a few years ago, somebody discovered that Chinese companies had bought, over a few years' time, had bought nuclear waste companies in France, in several other member states, small companies, so below the radar. So this did not end up at discussion tables in Brussels, and perhaps not even in Paris. So these little companies were then merged, and then somebody started researching this and found out that more than 50% of the nuclear waste industry in Europe was in the hands of Chinese state companies. Do we really want this? Perhaps not. So now even the Netherlands is agreeing with screening foreign investment. We actually, people from The Hague went to Paris, and together with the French, they drew up legislation, the protectionist French drew up legislation to protect our market, our industry. These are political decisions, of course. Yeah. So from totally depoliticizing, we go to, we have to think in a more political or geopolitical way. So I will, I've made a list of concrete examples of what is now changing in the European Union. And I think the first that should be mentioned of that list is that Europeans, many Europeans, they're still not very happy with the European Union, meaning with the way it functions. But they're certainly more happy than before to be in the European Union, that they're on this side of the border and not on the other side. You know, a bit Custine-like. One of the signs of this is, for instance, that a lot of populist parties, the FPÖ in Austria, wanted to leave the European Union. Marine Le Pen in France wanted to quit with the euro. She wanted to leave the eurozone. And there were many more. all of them have changed their minds. It's not just the war in Ukraine, it's also Brexit, of course, which is a disaster. But these developments have made them change their minds. So the ones who were advocating an exit before have changed their minds. They want to stay in. Mr. Orban in Hungary hates everything that has to do with Brussels, and he's open about it. He talks about it all the time. But no way he wants to leave. And they are trying now to step on the European podium. They used to rally against Europe and the fat cats in Brussels on a national podium. Now they're stepping more on a European podium. They don't want to leave anymore. They want to change Europe from the inside. And it's a totally different ballgame. This is one of the direct results of the war in Ukraine. The second thing that has changed is there used to be a huge fight between the nationalists on the one hand and the cosmopolitans on the other hand on borders. The nationalists wanted borders and fences and stop immigration and so on. The cosmopolitans were pleading for the opposite. We need to be open, etc. Well, you all know the discourse. The funny thing now is that even the cosmopolitans are understanding that we need borders. So somehow the balloon is that they have both blown up is losing air. The discrepancy between the two, the fight between the two, is not the main fight in the EU anymore. I find this very interesting, because that means that there's a lot of room for negotiations. How are we going to then do these borders? Huh? How are we going to manage migration better than before? People who have been involved in the completely stalled asylum and migration discussion in Europe are telling me that this makes the conversation easier. It's still not easy, but it's easier than it was. Number 3, the discourse has also changed in a different way. I live in Brussels for some years, and then I go out for a few years. And then I come back. So the last time I left Brussels was after the financial crisis and the euro crisis. 2013, I moved to Vienna. All the discussions in Brussels were on debt and deficit. Everything was about money, everything. So also existing policies, agriculture, transportation, market issues, everything. It was like a thick sauce of debt and deficit poured over it. Nowadays, so I came back 8 years later, in 2021, came back to Brussels, where I now live again. We still have an agricultural policy. We still have transportation, the market is still there. But the way we deal with them, the way we look at those policies has completely changed. The source is not debt and deficits, the source is security. Number 4. Interestingly enough, everybody, the north, the east and the south, is moving closer to the center. What do I mean by that? Well, let's start in Central Europe. Never say Eastern Europe to Central Europe, because it's not the same. For a long time, most of them became members in 2004. Until last year, I would say. All of them, or almost all of them, they felt a little bit like, second-class members. The big shots were France and Germany. They'd been around forever. And they felt like their concerns were not sufficiently taken into account, and their problems. Also, when they said, watch out what Vladimir Putin is doing, because the guy is dangerous, they were not listened to. I remember myself, I'm guilty of this too. Whenever I would discuss foreign policy with somebody from Poland, I would think, oh, this is really traumatic for them, you know. That's why they're exaggerating a little bit. Well, perhaps not. Huh? Now the Poles and many others are saying, the Baltic states, for instance, the Slovaks, we've told you so. Huh? We've told you that Putin would do this, would attack another sovereign neighbor. And this gives Central European countries much more of a voice. I find this super interesting, much more of a voice in Brussels. Some of the Baltics, they take initiatives, they have planned, the plan to collectively buy weapons for Ukraine came from the Prime Minister of Estonia. The biggest example, of course, is Poland, which is a big country, but which was, because of its rule of law dispute with the EU, was more or less in a corner. And everybody moved around Poland as much as they could. Well, Poland is a big country in Europe. And all of a sudden, Poland is back. Poland is back. They never wanted to have a single refugee from Syria because they thought it was not their war. Now they're taking millions. And better even, they're not meowing about it. 80% of all those refugees are not taken care of by the Polish state, but by people at home. They find beds and lodging just in private houses. It's amazing. And interestingly, you know, everything that goes to Ukraine or comes back goes via Poland. VAPs, humanitarian goods, weapons, everything. Interestingly enough, Poland, some in Brussels, of course, start complaining already that Poland is becoming too dominant. Poland tries to flex its muscles a little bit too much. Yeah. But at the same time, Poland also tries to get out of its rule of law problem with Brussels. Because now it has much more standing than, let's say, 2 years ago. And they use this standing to make compromises. Not enough, by far, but the fact that they are using their new status as leverage to get out of this problem is, I find, very interesting. Also, all of Central and Eastern Europe now have lots of Ukrainian refugees. And maybe they will not leave. Maybe they will stay forever. But these countries were so much against taking refugees from the rest of the world before, because their entire population is shrinking and shrinking fast, because everybody who wants a good job just goes to the west of Europe or Northern Europe. So all these countries, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland as well, they were bleeding people. It was a demographic disaster. So they were saying, if we lose our people, and at the same time, Syrians, dark people, Muslim people come in, we cannot handle this, we don't want to handle this. And we found this a terrible thing to say, you know. We, in the West, you realize that the European Union, or European integration, was started by 6 countries, 5 of whom were in the process of decolonizing at the time, in the early 1950s, except Luxembourg. So we are used to absorbing new people. I'm not saying that we ever found the secret to how to do it well, but at least we know the dilemma, and we're, in a way, we're used to it. This is a dilemma that in Central and Eastern Europe, they simply don't know. until now. They don't know it because since the end of the First World War in 1918, all these countries have become totally homogenic. They've moved people, well, they killed a lot of people too, but and the rest they moved across the border. You don't belong here, or they changed the border. So they are not used to having discussions about integration. Those kind of discussions, because of this terrible war in Ukraine, we are now having with Central and Eastern European countries. So it's sort of, also that makes the difficult asylum and migration negotiation much, I mean, easier is too big a word, but it makes it easier in some way. We are, for the first time, sharing that experience, which is important, I think. So in many ways, Central and Eastern Europe are now finally, after 20 years, emancipating a little bit in Brussels. But you can say the same thing of the Nordics, for instance. The Nordics, apart from Finland, the Nordics were just there for the market. Sweden and Denmark were there for the market. If you talk to older Swedes and Danes, they can explain to you how, when they first came to Brussels, it was the British guiding them around the institutions and telling them, like, this is the council and this is the commission, and you know, if you have any questions, here's my phone number and we'll explain. The Swedes, even after the Brexit referendum, when the UK was still more or less in, they kept voting with British MEPs, even if it was not in their interest at all, just out of habit. Yeah. So now, with the war, they look at Europe like Finland has always looked at Europe. Why? It's very interesting. If you ask a Finn, why do you have the euro? You know, Sweden doesn't want it, Denmark doesn't want it, Norway doesn't even want to be a member. So what makes you so, you know, sharing everything, Schengen, the euro? They have, their answer is one word: security. It's always been like this. Because they have this long border with Russia. And it was a friendly border, but they never really trusted the Russians either. They have one of the best armies in Europe, the Finns. In the Netherlands, when you ask people, why do we have the euro? Most people cannot answer the question. Those who can answer it often say, well, it's because we had all these exchange rates which were clashing, and every time if the Fed in the United States would raise or lower interest rates, then we had the Deutschmark and the franc, for instance, were reacting differently in Europe. And immediately the French and the German governments would fight like hell. So each time they did something in America, there was a political quarrel in Europe. That's why we took the euro, to get rid of all these exchange rates in Europe. That's a very technical reason, and it was definitely part of the reason why we have the euro now. But the euro is becoming a part of our security now as well, because it is a political construct. Remember when the Americans stepped out of the nuclear deal with Iran? And we stuck to the deal in Iran, and our companies, some of them at least, could legally trade with the Republic of Iran. And they kept doing this, of course, because they were still in the deal. And this was the deal. And we were still in it. Then these companies were punished. They could not use Wall Street. They could not use dollars. And everything in the international trade arena goes via the dollar. If you want to change a real into a euro, it goes via the dollar. So for the Americans, the dollar is a weapon. For the Chinese now, the dollar, the, the yuan is a weapon too. You know, they want all their payments suddenly in yuans. And some countries are happy to comply with that. The euro, for us, is becoming a geopolitical instrument as well. The Finns have understood this already long ago. But now the rest of the Nordics are also understanding this. So Denmark is joining the defense initiatives in Europe. They had a referendum and it was a big yes, just a few months after the war broke out in Ukraine. They are both, Sweden and Denmark, are thinking of joining the banking union as well. Why? Not just because of the banks. It's another layer of security. When the Norwegians, not a member, found out we were collectively going to buy weapons for Ukraine, they were the first to knock on the doors. Can we join? Security. Everybody is moving more towards the center. But we have the south as well, where, especially in the Netherlands, we tend to think that all the problems come from the south. Well, for a while, it looked like this, yeah. But guess what? Things have changed there too. A lot of reforms that we forced them to implement have worked. The economy is doing much better. What we have done during the pandemic, during Eurobonds, to support our economies to recover, has finally made big investors all over the world trust Europe again. So they start investing in Southern Europe, which is great. Moreover, in the south of Europe, especially in Portugal and Spain, they hardly had an energy crisis this winter, because we never wanted to make the pipelines all the way to Spain and Portugal so they could use Russian gas. They had to fend for themselves. They had to arrange their own energy packages. And they did. So when Vladimir Putin cut us off from the gas supply, guess who were saying, like, do you want some of our energy? It was Spain and it was Portugal. Yeah, very interesting, I think. The Netherlands, because we're here in the Netherlands now, is changing too. This started with Brexit. And now, with the war in Ukraine, the changes are even more evident, becoming more evident. I think the Prime Minister is not keen to talk about these things. But in all those years, you know, flirting with the far right, advocating an exit even, he is starting to understand that actually staying in the EU is giving us sovereignty. If, for instance, Facebook, if they violate data protection rules in the Netherlands, and Mark Rutte picks up the phone and calls California, they will probably answer because he's a prime minister, right? But they will not change their behavior because they just go around the Netherlands. They will come around. That's what happened with Belgium as well. They can afford to ignore it. So Rutte is powerless in this. But if a European commissioner picks up the phone and calls Facebook or, you know, Google or any one of them, saying you are violating our rules and now you have to change your behavior and pay a fine, they do this. Billions of fines they are paying, and they change their behavior. Nowadays, most of these tech companies in the United States are actually following European data protection rules in California, in the United States, where the rules are very lax. Why? Because those are the strictest in the world, and if you follow those, you're good everywhere. Much easier than following one regime in the US, another one in Vietnam, a third one in Europe. That's great. So in that sense, staying in for the Netherlands gives us sovereignty. Otherwise you go under. If you ask, there's a think tank, and I'm a member of it, so I see their reports. They ask routinely decision makers in all the EU capitals, so the 27 capitals. If you want to push something in Brussels, or you want to block something in Brussels, can also happen, who do you call first? You sound out the other member states a little bit before you take action. If you find out nothing wants it, okay, you give up, perhaps. So who do you call first? Well, first Berlin, of course, still. The big Macher, the big power machine. Then, for a little while, there's nothing. And the second one is, of course, Paris. Paris, France is a big country, can have a lot of weight. If you have those big ones on your side, I mean, you're almost there. Number 3 is the Netherlands. Number 3 is the Netherlands. Since Brexit, since we did not have the UK on our side in many discussions, not everything, because the UK didn't have the euro, they didn't have Schengen and so on, but a lot of market issues. We always, if we wanted something in Brussels, we would phone London. I know people who did this routinely. If London said, yeah, good idea, then you just ask the Danes and the Swedes and perhaps 1 or 2 more, and that was it. So it made the Netherlands very lazy in Europe. Very lazy. We never went to Bulgaria or to Spain or to Greece or to Austria. Well, Austria sometimes, but not a lot. After Brexit, this game changed completely. So the Dutch diplomats and also people from ministries are all the time, I see them in the tallies to Paris all the time, like, hey, how are you doing? Yes, yeah, we're cooking something with the French and so on. Because we never agree with the French on anything. So better go straight there and start making proposals together, you know. And if other member states in Europe, if they see that, it's the Netherlands and France, it's probably good, somewhere good in the middle, I can live with that. It works well. Yeah. There's also a lot of traffic to Madrid all of a sudden. The Dutch love the Spaniards suddenly, on many different levels. Yeah. They love the Baltics as well, and Ireland, and all of a sudden, so the Netherlands is building a network. On every theme, the network is different, and it changes all the time. But if you are, say, Italy, and you want something, and you want to sound out countries, it's probably good if you have the Netherlands on your side, because they can bring in many others. It's funny, huh? Yeah. So this is how the Netherlands is changing too. And I think even if Mark Rutte and the others are not talking a lot about it, you know, they still love this story from Brussels has decided this. Yeah, and we were not there. Well, I'm telling you, I've been working in and out of Brussels since 1999. The member states have the power in Europe. Brussels means us. Brussels means us. Never believe for a second when somebody tells you it's those bureaucrats who decided this for us. No. It's the member states who take all the decisions. And now, I'm going to explain to you why the member states are becoming even more powerful than they were before. So we've all established now that there's more Europe than before because of COVID and especially because of the war in Ukraine. We work on an energy union, on defense, we work on borders together, etc., etc. So there's more Europe. So the European Commission, who is administering, managing all this more Europe, is more powerful too. But guess what? Usually The story is that if the Commission is more powerful, if there's more Europe, there's less national power, right? The more power we bring to Europe, the more we lose it, and the weaker we become. But in this case, it is different. Not only is Europe, Brussels, the Commission, becoming more powerful, but the member states are becoming more powerful too. Because what is happening now is that 20 minutes ago we were saying that Europe was very good in depoliticizing issues, breaking things into technical bits. When I arrived in Brussels in '99, you know, everybody was joking about these bananas, that Brussels was so intrusive that they would even determine the shape of that the banana should have. My God, this Brussels, what is it? What, you know, it shouldn't be none of its business. But now, the Europe that we have and that we're getting is all about sensitive issues. It's not about, you know, how long or how curved the banana can be. No, it is about health, which used to be a completely national, or still is for the most part, completely national competence. Europe has nothing to do with it. About health, about our currency, about security, about energy. These are very sensitive issues. We're using Eurobonds for the first time. I mean, we've used them before, but not to this extent. All these things are very sensitive. Usually, it was the member states, I told you, the member states have the power. The Commission makes a proposal for European regulation, a law, but it is the member states. If the member states don't want the proposal, they just put it in a drawer and that's where it stays for a long time, until they decide that it is time for it to come out. Now, so they used to take the decision, they would ask the Commission, they would take the decision, and then they would leave the implementation to the Commission. The Commission is running all these shows. It is controlling, checking all these regulations for banks. It is checking the debts and the deficits of the member states, and they all hate it, so we know about it. But they are managing all this kind of stuff that the member states have decided to do together in Europe. But it was always when the Commission, when the decision was taken, the member states stepped back and let the Commission do the implementation and the management. These days are over. The member states are staying on for the implementation. They don't want to let the Commission run all these sensitive issues on a European level alone. An example is the vaccine procurement. Member states wanted to, they understood that they needed vaccines when the pandemic struck. And of course they tried to get vaccines on their own, you know, or in little groups of 2 or 3. But then they quickly understood that the big countries, who are richer, would get the vaccines first and probably cheaper too. And the small countries would get them much later and for a higher price. Which would bring us to a situation where some countries were fully vaccinated and others had not even gotten their first doses yet. So what do you see then? Borders. This would have destroyed the single market. Mark Rutte, Prime Minister Rutte, who went together with the Germans, tried to buy some vaccines as well, understood this too. And this is why they all went back to Brussels and asked the Commission, can you please buy vaccines for us? At the time, it wasn't even clear, there were no vaccines yet. There were companies, pharmaceutical companies, that were going to try to produce them, but nobody knew which ones would deliver and when, and which one would not. So they had to negotiate contracts with several companies all over the world, which they did. But health is so much of a national competence, and it was such pandemonium already in each member state over the right policy that they just did not want to leave it to the Commission. So every draft contract that the Commission drew up with the pharmaceutical company had to go to 27 member states first, to the capitals. And there they were checked, because some of us have pharmaceutical companies too. Some of us didn't like, paragraph 17D or whatever. Some people were on holiday as well. So that's why it took a little bit longer. Remember, the British were Boris Johnson was so happy that he was 2 weeks ahead of us. I mean, these 2 weeks, they felt like 2 years, of course. But it was not just the Commission who was screwing things up. It was the member states too. Because if they would have just let the Commission get on with it, it would have been much faster. Yeah. So they stay on in the implementation phase. They also, every member state has the right to decide for himself. They all have a little basket with vaccines, and they decide if they want only AstraZeneca, or if they want BioNTech and AstraZeneca, or, the precise mix, because all these vaccines are a little bit different. Even that, they want to decide for themselves. Interesting, huh? The second example of how they stay on during the implementation phase is Next Generation EU, those 850 billion euros used during the pandemic, or actually used only now, but decided during the pandemic to help our economies recover the economic hits that they got. So all the member states, once it was decided, all the member states are sending project proposals to Brussels. And in Brussels, you have people who look at those proposals and just screen them. Is there enough sustainability? Is there enough, I don't know what, gender, everything? Oh, there's this whole list of criteria. Is it going to be an innovative project? Because that was also a criteria. Many criteria. And guess what? It's not just the Commission doing this, it's the member states. They sit there too. And they look at each other's projects. Which on the one hand you can say it is good because they feel ownership with this. And I think it's a lot of money. And taxpayers' money is national money in Europe. So yeah, you're sitting there on behalf of your own tax inspector a little bit, or your Minister of Finance, whatever, to see if your pennies are well spent in a country like, whatever, Bulgaria or Denmark. But it can also be bad, of course. Because suppose the Netherlands, we always have this sort of bias against Italy. Right? We think that Italians are living off our money. And we work hard for that money, and the Italians are in the sun. When I tell somebody that actually Italy is a net payer to the European budget, mouths in the Netherlands fall open. Nah. But yes, they pay more than they get out of it. Anyway, but there's always this sensitivity between the two countries. Imagine if the Dutch start rejecting Italian projects. How are the Italians going to respond? Perhaps not with, by blocking other projects, but maybe. Or maybe in a totally different field. This is maybe a bit too much politicization, in my view. But that was not the point. The point was that we are not only getting more Europe, we're also getting a more intergovernmental Europe, in a way. My 8th point is that we also pay more, because of the war, more attention to values. Much more than before. We fought so much over banks and over refugees and over the euro and many other things. Then there was Brexit, which hurt too. That it is time, and you feel it in many countries, it is also time now to start talking about what unites us. And again, think of Christine. This is now also a little bit easier because this Putin is there all the time. So I think the problems that have to do with the rule of law are going to persist, because that's part of this, of course. We're talking here about values. And for a long time we were busy with the euro, and we were busy with Brexit and with refugees and so on. We've let that problem rot a little bit too long. And now we have to assume it, and that's what we're doing, and it's painful. But values, it's interesting also in the Netherlands. For a long time, the Netherlands was known as the comptable, the accountant of Europe. You know, we were always very stingy with our pennies. But this is such a negative story, always, because then you have to say no, 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 all the time, which we did for a while. Doesn't make you very popular in Europe. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has now put values, since like 2-3 years, has put values as a real second pillar. So they're organizing seminars all the time and trainings for judges and lawyers from Central Europe or the south of Europe, or very, very often, because it is something positive. It is something that citizens can identify with, and it's a good issue. Yeah, although it leads to painful disputes as well. Number 9, Europe used to be a legislative machine. We were producing laws. And member states who decided on these laws, again, it was them, but they had to abide by those laws. But we used the EU to produce those laws. But Europe is now much more delivering goodies too, not just laws and regulations, delivering vaccines, delivering gas, weapons, many, many things. And I'm sure we will see more of it. There is one of the smartest political scientists in Europe is a woman, actually. She's an Irish woman. She's called Bridget Lafan. And she wrote a very interesting paper just 2 months ago, I think. And she says, we always look at Europe in terms of power over. How much power does Brussels have over the member states? But it is time to look at Europe from a different angle. Not in terms of power over the member states, but power to produce goodies, power to act, power to keep Putin away, for instance. And that's a totally different way of looking at Europe. And I think she's very right, because we have also seen that power over doesn't really mean anything, because member states also get more power over. So it's a stagnant discussion, and it doesn't enable you to see all the changes that are taking place in Europe, which I think are fascinating. Yeah. So a different way to look at Europe. The member states are more powerful. European institutions are also more powerful. Yeah. There are concrete goodies being delivered to the member states at the request of the member states, because they wanted to have the vaccines. They wanted to have the corona funds to help our economies. They want to have gas, because otherwise, people cannot heat their houses, and so on. So the member states demand it, and they get it. Yeah. So we should have much more a focus, not on what Europe cannot do, but on what Europe can do. And it's actually quite a lot. So Europe is changing. I'm rounding up now, so you can ask your questions. Europe is changing for a large part because of huge pressure coming from outside. It is really exactly what happened to Christine, and that's why I read his little booklet again. But it is also how the Netherlands got together. Do you remember the stories about the provinces, the Dutch provinces? And they were all jockeying for power, and they were all looking down on Drenthe because they didn't have the money. And every time Drenthe needed to be rescued again, literally, financially, what the others decided is that all the soldiers would live in Drenthe from now on. So let them have it, you know, these silly people from Drenthe. Yeah. But what united them, it was this fight against the Spaniards. I've lived in Switzerland, so I've been diving into some Swiss history as well. The cantons have always been, they're still incredibly autonomous. And then everything in the Canton de Vaud is better than in the Canton de Valais. Even you live in Vaud, and everybody is of the opinion that the wine they make in Valais is undrinkable. And they really believe it. They marry Chinese women, but the wine from Valais is just undrinkable. Voila. So, but these cantons have always been like this. What united them? How is it on earth was it possible that they ever accepted to be together in one state? It was the fight against the Habsburg Empire. That united them, in some ways. Yeah. Me, I felt European. I mean, whenever you're out of the Netherlands, you feel how Dutch you are, and that never passes. I've left the Netherlands 30 years ago. And I can still see Dutch people. I was in the opera in Brussels last week, and you know, waiting for somebody, and you can, like from 500 meters away, you can see, this guy is Dutch. And yes, it's the way of walking, it's his shoes, his glasses, his hair, it's everything. I can't really explain it. It's a feeling that you have. So I'm never going to say I'm not Dutch, because the more I live abroad, the more I realize how Dutch I am. Sometimes my kids, in the morning, they see me coming downstairs and, Mom, you're wearing your Dutch dress. And that doesn't mean that I bought that dress in the Netherlands, but they just think that it's a very Dutch dress. Okay. But I felt European. I never felt European until I moved to the Middle East. I lived in the Middle East, in the Arab world, in the 1990s, for 5 years. There, I felt European for the first time. Because it was, I saw people were doing and thinking so many things in a different way than me. I'm not saying better or worse, but just different, that you're like Alice in Wonderland all the time. So you feel very European. But I think nowadays, and there was a time when this was the case for everybody. You had to go to Japan or to Colombia or to Botswana or something to be able to feel a little bit European. And to bond with a Swede, for God's sake, or a Spaniard or something. Yeah. Now, with this war raging on our doorstep, I think people for the first time are able just to sit in front of the television and feel European. Yeah. So, I think Europe is really, really changing a lot. And if you are so kind to invite me again or in a few years' time, it's probably the story will have evolved much more, because there's really, everything is changing. How it is going to change, I don't know. Things can go off a cliff, things can go much better, and everything in between. Probably the in-between again, as usual. Yeah. But I have no idea. But so we leave that for the next time. And now it's time for your questions, I hope. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, we have the microphone, we have the first question there. Thank you very much.
How will the European Union react towards the uneventable migration of people due to climate change in regards to, of course, the divide I notice around in the news and stuff of people who want to close the borders and who want to open up or keep the borders open, like the nationalists usually want to close the borders and lessen migration to mainly keep culture and for financial reasons, while the others always want to open the borders, I think more of humanitarian reasons, because we always want to help people in need.
Yeah, very good question. You know, we have two conflicting trends in a way. On the one hand, and you see it even when I arrived today, you see everywhere, we need workers. Huh? Restaurants are crying for workers. There was a train that I needed to take today, and they didn't have anybody to drive the train. So, you know, I had to take the next. We are reminded every day of a screaming shortage of people to keep our economies going. I think this is a very important trend, and it's there all over Europe. The other trend, of course, is more known, is that we don't want any foreigners, or some of us don't want any foreigners, and those are usually the loudest in politics, because they scare people and then they gather their votes. At the same time, we cannot allow everybody to come in, because everybody wants to come to Europe. Or maybe not everybody, but a lot of people, too many people. So we need some kind of a system to manage it, and a system with good criteria, a system with good checks and balances, with carrots and with sticks. And I've followed this debate since 1999, because that's when we started to have a discussion about, you know, a common asylum and migration policy. Because if you have Schengen, so you take the internal borders away, so from that follows automatically that if you want to be able to check anybody or anything, for that matter, that comes in or goes out, you have to do it at the external borders, together. And we've been stuck in difficult debates since then. What you see, and what gives me also the hope that in the end some kind of pragmatism and humanitarianism will prevail, is that countries are doing, especially Germany, are doing more and more experiments with legal migration. Italy it's all quiet, you know, they don't want the people to really know that they're doing this, but they need to be doing this. And if you don't allow people, and I firmly believe in this, if you don't allow people to come legally, even the high-skilled people, then there's no choice for them to take the illegal route and step on one of these dinghies in now it's Tunisia, and drown as well. If you offer people legal ways of coming, with criteria, with tests, with, you know, diplomas being asked, whatever, there's no need for them to come in this terrible way. And there's also an incentive. If you need a certain diploma, okay, I'm going back to school and I'm trying to get this diploma so that I can maybe qualify in 2 years. I think this, in the end, is where we should be going. But for the time, we were still flip-flopping. But it's a real dilemma.
Okay, thanks. We had 2 questions, one in the second row.
I can appreciate your positive take about the consequences of the Ukrainian war for the European Union. It has several positive effects, as you mentioned. You also mentioned a few negative effects. In general, I miss the shadow side. You discussed much less than the positive side. So what can
Which
you...
one? Which shadow side?
That's my question.
Okay. Yeah.
I would like to hear. There are many disadvantages of the war. So, what is in your vision? I can speak about it, but it's your turn.
Yes. Okay. Well, one of the disadvantages that it is very costly, and we have no choice. We cannot just drop Ukraine and throw it under the bus and let Putin have it. I don't think we can, and we don't want it. What is going to be a huge challenge is making Ukraine a member of the European Union. And also, because also this is fascinating in Brussels. There's a whole Directorate General, like a ministry. It's called DG Enlargement, or NEAR it's called now, I think. For many, many years, there was enlargement fatigue in Europe. Nobody wanted it, especially in the Netherlands and in France, for instance. We were blocking a lot of candidate countries from coming in, or from even progressing in the negotiations. So the people working on enlargement in Brussels, again, they don't take the decision. But it's a huge process, because everything has to be according to our rules in that place. And in a country of war, how do you do this? I mean, I once, before the enlargement in 2004, I went to Poland just to visit slaughterhouses, because we don't want this mad cow disease anymore. We have, in European law, enshrined exact rules and regulations about how many square meters of tiles you need to have in your slaughterhouse, in your abattoir, if you process so and so many animals per week, whatever. Yeah. For most of the slaughterhouses in Poland, this was even undoable, you know. They had to just tear down their whole slaughterhouse and build a new one. And it's expensive too. I mean, there was financing for it, but not everything, of course. And how, but, you know, Poland was already big, but, you know, Ukraine is a bit bigger too. And Ukraine is in war. Ukraine was a very corrupt country as well. I think now, what I hear, is it understands what is at stake. If Ukraine is not managing to get into the EU at some point, it is lost. It is lost. So it has to. So it is really trying to clear itself up, but it is not easy. If you're losing people on the battlefield, and if you have different, you know, things to fry. So all these people working in DG NEAR, they always had the instruction, political instruction, like, you know, be as strict as possible and make sure that they will never get there in a way. You know, they were technical people, not political people, trying to help, not at all. Now, all of a sudden, they have a different instruction. The instruction is, we have to help Ukraine to get ready. You know, that means we have to be strict, but also we have to offer them carrots. So basically you need different people to work with that. I think this is going to be a huge challenge, and not only Ukraine, because if we let Ukraine in, what about North Macedonia? What about Albania? They've been waiting in the waiting room for a long time. What this will do to the European Union is, to me, a big question mark. I don't know. It can reinvigorate us, but it can also be very damaging. I don't know. I hope they manage. But that's, for me, is a, yeah.
Thank you very much, Mr. de Gruyter, for a very convincing analysis, which is both, I would say, broad on the one hand, but certainly has a number of layers and deep layers at the same time. Thank you very much for that. I found it very enlightening. I would like to ask you for some more.
Okay.
And I would like to invite you to say at least a few words, if you could, on the geopolitical side, on the global perspective, and the position of Europe, the EU particularly, on the now rapidly changing global political scene, with China and the US taking different positions with respect to one another, of course, but also perhaps
Yeah.
with respect to Europe. Could you just say a few words about that, please?
Yeah. I'm a little bit afraid that if what the big story in the world is America versus China. That's the big story. I think where we are is in a difficult place. We're not in the middle because we are Western. At the same time, we would not like to be completely in the American basket. This is what Macron always talks about, the French president, strategic autonomy. Even if we end up supporting many of the American policies, we should not be forced to take over all of them. And especially when it applies to China, I think. We have to be careful. I think we have to be vigilant. We also have to be vigilant because these two are just basically, what keeps the Americans awake at night? It's not the war in Ukraine, it is China, and vice versa. They're both sort of trying to manage the war in Ukraine so that it doesn't do too much damage to their ambitions, right? So we're not in the best spot in that sense. This is power politics, and Europe is not good at power politics. We are very powerful in the world because of our economic clout, because of all these rules and regulations that even companies in Australia and America want to follow. The Brussels effect, they call it. But we're often slow in recognizing geopolitical dangers. We've been slow in seeing what Vladimir Putin was up to, and I think we could have done some things differently as well. I'm not saying it's our fault at all. But I think we should have seen this coming more. And the same applies to China. China is, in several European countries, is operating mobile telephone systems. Is that so smart? I'm not sure. It owns a lot of terminals in our ports. Is that so smart? I'm not so sure. So the question for Europe is how much of a geopolitical choice will it keep having? And I think this is what we should try to preserve, some kind of room for maneuvering. And we will also have to deal with difficult autocrats in the world, like we did our migration deal with Turkey, which doesn't deserve any beauty prize, I'm afraid. And I understand all the criticism, but at least it worked, and it still works. So sometimes you have to be a little bit more pragmatic and not lecturing the entire world. Difficult position, because we're not central to anything. So we have to be smart instead.
Okay. We have a question from the young man in the light blue shirt. And while the microphone is getting to him, I'm gonna sneak something in. This is about the geopolitical question. So if we look at gas, if we look at then China, is it so that we always do that when we're absolutely forced into it? To come back to your security theme.
We do what
So
when we're forced to?
that we take measures to increase our independence or our autonomy, like with gas, for example. It took a lot of pushing and shooting before we did anything. And there are people talking about how our dependence on China is pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Does it really have to go that far before we come together, in your view, when you look at the different ways that we deal with security?
Yeah, I think we're acting a bit faster nowadays because we've woken up from a long and deep slumber. I remember when I was in Vienna in 2014, which is when Putin invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. I was writing, for instance, about how Russian diplomats were completely obstructing the workings of the OSCE in Vienna. How it was lying, how it was using. I mean, they behaved in a terrible way. All the rules and regulations, they just threw them out of the window. When I would write about this, people would accuse me of, being anti-Putin or something, or anti-Russian. I mean, crazy. I was just describing what was happening there. Now I don't get this reproach anymore. I think finally now everybody can see what this man is up to, and God knows what else he's up to. But yeah, I think we've been naive. We all grew up with the idea that we would never have war again in Europe or at its doorstep. And even the war in Ukraine, it was not in the EU or in the European community at the time. And I think many people looked at it as a sort of a leftover conflict from the Cold War, right? That still needed to be fought out and resolved, unfortunately. I participated in many seminars and conferences over the past 2 decades with the theme like, does Europe need a new narrative? And then people would say, young people, they've never been in a war. They won't have a war because we don't have wars in Europe. We are above that. So what is the new narrative going to be? Something with innovation, maybe something with China, something... they never managed to find something else. I always told them, look, never again. Europe is an internal project. We are, if we don't have this sort of a common structure, however mediocre it is, because it's not beautiful, but because everybody can live with it somehow, it works. Much better. Yeah.
Thanks. Now, I'm just looking at the clock. We have one question. I know that there are a couple of other hands up, but here's what we got to do. We need to wrap up in the room at 9 o'clock, but there are drinks afterwards, and
so you can. I'll be there, so you can
talk and ask questions there as well. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So.
Many thanks for your insightful talk and the pointers. And my question relates to what you just mentioned about the enlargement of Europe, and also some of the things you said quite at the start of your talk when you mentioned that we've moved from a ring of friends to a ring of fire. And I was wondering if our friends have become the fire, or whether we've simply swallowed our friends and moved closer to the fire. In other words, did Europe and the European Union grow outside of its safe zone?
I think some former friends have, with some, rightly so, in a way, have become much less friendly because we didn't want to let them in. Look at a country like Serbia, for instance. They're just fed up with us, and I can understand why they're fed up with us. We were not in the mood anymore. The big enlargement, which I think geopolitically made sense in 2004, but it was big. It took us a long time to digest it. In many ways, we're still digesting it, and they too. So yeah, I think several countries on the Balkans have paid a price for that. And they've become recalcitrant. They're kicking up a fuss. They're, making sweet business with Putin and so on. And they're playing one against the other. And I'm not sure it's right, but I can understand why they're doing it. I think the UK is also an example of a friend becoming almost a foe. There's a lot of bad things have been said in London over the past couple of years. they're always railing against European bureaucracy and rules and regulations. But who were the biggest demandeurs during the membership of more European rules and regulations? It was the UK. Because for the UK, the market was never big and deep enough. The Netherlands was also a bit like that, also very much demandeur. And in their view, the larger the market and the deeper the market as well, the less political unity you will have. You know, if you end up with 35, it's quite difficult to agree on anything. It's already difficult with 27, more difficult than with 15, for instance. The UK has actively pushed this, also for this reason, because they don't like political unity in Europe. They don't want Europe to be political. They want it to be a market and nothing more, which is fine. They've always been very honest about it too, you know. So all the yelling from London, yeah, I think it was taken very badly in many other European capitals, including in The Hague. Yeah. Although it's changing a little bit now. Let's see what Mr. Sunak manages to do. Yes. I think with Russia, for a time, we had some kind of a workable relationship, which went off the rails. Yeah. So it's a mixture of both, I think.
I thought over and over about my question, and at the end, I thought, like, Russia is part of Europe. And if you look at the culture of Russia, in arts, they were leading, and they became a flow in Europe. So how did the European Union start after the Second World War? And the aim was to get peace. What I think about the European Union is, like, they lost their identity. They didn't even have an identity, like, in peace. So the vision of peace is missing. And this missing link makes that we are now in war, I suppose.
We're not in war.
We are in war with Russia for a part. Like,
we are not
say.
in war with Russia. Russia may be in war with us, but we've never declared war against Russia, and we are not in war. We are precisely trying to stay out of this bloody war.
Oh.
We're not going into Ukraine to fight
let's
against
make it
the Russians.
concrete. If is there a vision of the European Union to make peace instead of weapons? Because if
instead
of weapons, instead of military action, that's the missing link, I suppose. Therefore, we are in sort of war all over the world.
Yes, okay, yeah. No, I completely disagree with you. I think the European Union, or whatever, Europe, is an internal project. This is what I just said. The aim of the whole project is to make sure that after 2 world wars, where European countries started attacking each other and, you know, tipped the entire continent in total chaos with millions of deaths, and it was always France and Germany, that they would not start this another time. They did it in 1870. It was a big war. They did it in 1914 to 1918. The whole continent was completely destroyed. And they did it again for many years after. They did it again in 39-45. European integration was an answer to that. This is why Germany and France agreed to put their entire steel and coal production under an independent management, which was the precursor for the European Commission. Coal and steel were used for the war industry. It was only about them, you know. There were a few other countries. Italy came in, the Benelux came in, and then slowly, later a few more, and later again more. It has always been an internal project. Whenever something happens in the world, in whichever field, it can be a disease, it can be a war, it can be a trade issue. Whenever something happens to the world and Europe has to respond, you can see that it is an internal project. Because all the chickens are flying through the cot, you know. Everybody, all the countries in Europe, you know, I've lived in many corners of Europe now. Every time I move to a new European country, I don't understand anything. Every country has its own culture, its own traditions, its own taboos, its own history, language, religion. The health systems are entirely different. The schooling system is entirely different. Everything is totally different, really. I can assure you. It takes me years to sort of, you know, start understanding it. So, when something happens in Europe or outside Europe that we have to react to, they all disagree. You know, ask an Estonian, what is the biggest challenge? The answer will be different when you ask a Portuguese or an Irish person or a Bulgarian. Their biggest challenges are all different. That's why we can never think ahead. We can never prepare. Well, maybe with one exception, it's the climate. But for the rest, everybody wants Europe to go in a different direction. Member states only act if they really can't solve a big problem alone. So that's what Europe is about. Europe is not, it doesn't project its powers, except economically, abroad. It doesn't. It doesn't want to, and it can't. We cannot wage any offensive wars. I mean, I've written a book comparing the EU and the Habsburg Empire. The surviving Habsburgers will all tell you, they told me at least, why did the Habsburg Empire perish at the end of the First World War? Because they started that bloody war and they lost control. Because everybody started to join in and, you know, the Kaiser didn't have the power to do anything he wanted anymore. When you have, and that was a state, we're not a state, you know, we're 27 states under a common roof. When it comes to war and peace, we cannot go to war because, you know, some would want it and others don't want it. So we can't. The only thing we can do is defend ourselves. Or try to defend ourselves, and that's what we're doing now. So it's an internal project, nothing more. Bar?
Bar. So I want to thank you for the wide-ranging and insightful talk. It's, again, been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you, too, for having me. Thanks for coming.